Alberta, one of Canada's richest and most productive provinces, has a history of political complexity and a strong sense of distinction from the rest of the country. Since its inception in 1905, Alberta has been considered economically vibrant but politically marginalized. While the country was under the domain of a central government in Ottawa, Alberta felt that her needs and interests were often ignored. This feeling of being on the sidelines is not new and dates back to the early days of the province, when he found himself in contrast to Canada's political and economic capital. Throughout the 20th century, the separatist feeling gained strength, especially as the province faced challenges in terms of distribution of resources and power. However, one of the central issues that always divided Alberta from the rest of Canada was its enormous wealth in natural resources, particularly oil. In a country with a centralized policy, where fiscal collection and economic policy decisions were dominated by Ottawa, Alberta was wronged, as her resources were being explored to benefit other parts of Canada. These disputes began to gain visibility in the late 1920s and 30s, when attempts to create a province called the Buffalo Province failed. This generated a growing frustration, which only increased by the creation of what would be known as the National Energy Program in the 1970s, during the government of Pierre Trudeau. This policy aimed, among other things, the stricter control of Canadian energy resources, which was seen as an attempt to expropriate Alberta's oil profits to benefit the rest of the country. Approved under the pretext of ensuring national energy security, the program became a point of discord and further fueled the idea that Alberta should separate from the rest of Canada or at least seek more autonomy. In the 1930s, the supporters of the separatist idea found support within the Social Credit Party, led by William Aberhart. Although Aberhart avoided the idea of rupture with Canada, he promoted the idea of greater economic autonomy for the province, which fed the separatist movement. His successor, Ernest Manning, followed this line of thought, especially after the discovery of oil in abundance in Alberta's underground. This has further intensified tensions, as the province now had a source of wealth that, in the eyes of many, should be controlled more autonomously and less centralized. The 1970s brought a significant climb in this tense relationship with Ottawa. That was when the National Energy Program was introduced. For Alberta, the program was more than an economic policy. It was seen as a direct threat to its most fundamental interests. This program, which proposed the exploitation of natural resources in terms that favored the economy of the rest of Canada, was interpreted by many Albertans as an attempt to centralize control over the richness of the province, which generated an inflammatory political environment. In the following years, this would generate fertile ground for new separatist movements, with parties such as the Concept of Western Canada and the Confederation of Regions, although without the substantial electoral success so that they could cause effective change in the country's political system. This tension between Alberta and Ottawa dragged on for decades, until it reached the beginning of the new millennium. In the 2000s, the Reformist Party, which advocated a decentralization of power and greater autonomy for the provinces, gained some support. However, the idea of total separation has lost strength, especially since the party never totally embraced the idea of a break with Canada. Nevertheless, the separatist feeling never fully disappeared and remained a latent chain, waiting for an opportunity to resurface. In 2015, with the election of Justin Trudeau for the position of Prime Minister, the situation intensified again. Trudeau's stance, especially in relation to environmental policy and its position against the use of bituminous sands, which are a great source of oil in Alberta, rekindled separatist feelings. For many in Alberta, Trudeau's proposal to gradually abandon the exploration of bituminous sands represented a direct threat to his way of life and his economy, which strongly depends on oil. This federal government action was seen as an attempt to dismantle the province's energy industry, which fed the idea that Alberta could no longer expect reforms within a Canadian federation that, in her view, no longer represented her interests. In addition, it was in 2019 that the term Exit Alberta began to gain strength on social networks, with various groups and political movements starting to articulate the idea of an independent Alberta, or at least more autonomous. This movement, which found inspiration in Brexit, came as a response to what many saw as a growing marginalization of the province in relation to the central government of Ottawa. Amid this scenario of growing frustration, the separatist movement gained a new breath. the arrival of 2025 and the re-election of the Liberal Party, which continued to prioritize policies that many in Alberta considered hostile to their economy, culminated in a point of inflection. Discussions about a referendum for Alberta's independence began to intensify. Some political figures, such as Provincial Prime Minister Danielle Smith, began working on proposals to facilitate the convening of plebiscites, paving the way so that Alberta's population could directly decide on issues such as sovereignty or even the separation of Canada. As the tensions in Alberta continued to grow, the political situation became increasingly volatile. In the period following Justin Trudeau's election in 2015, many in Alberta felt that their frustrations were not being heard, which led to an increase in support for movements that sought greater autonomy or, in more extreme cases, the total separation of the province. Although separatist feeling never completely disappeared, he has gained new contours due to what many in Alberta saw as harmful federal policies, especially with regard to the energy industry. One of the main friction points was Trudeau's position in relation to the oil and gas sector. Approved with the promise that Canada would be greener and greener, Trudeau's proposal to reduce carbon emissions and opposition to the use of bituminous sands shocked many Albertans. Bituminous sand oil represents not only a vital source of energy, but also an essential part of the local economy. For many, federal government proposals seem to ignore the province's economic realities, generating frustration and solidifying the idea that Alberta needed to become more independent to protect her interests. This separatist movement found a new momentum after 2019, when Alberta's idea separate from the rest of Canada began to gain strength. Inspired by Brexit's victory, leaving the UK from the European Union, several groups began to use the phrase "Exit Alberta" as a war cry, proposing that the province should become an independent state or even join the United States. For many advocates of this idea, independence was seen as Alberta's only way to ensure their economic survival, especially when federal government policies seemed to be hurting their main industries. However, the movement for the separation of Alberta was not unanimous. Although there was strong support in some areas, such as rural areas and in some large cities, other regions of the province saw the separation with skepticism, questioning the economic and political implications of an independent Alberta. The issue became even more complex when considering what a real separation would imply citizens and the local economy. As a province rich in natural resources, Alberta deeply depended on his business relations with the rest of Canada, and many feared that separation could result in economic isolation, with unpredictable consequences. The perspective of a referendum on independence also began to take shape in the province. Several political leaders and social movements, such as Alberta's Conservative Unity Movement, began to press the convening of a plebiscite to determine whether Albertanos supported the separation or not. The idea of performing a referendum was considered by some as a necessary step to legitimize the province's desire for autonomy, while others saw this as a risky political play that could further divide Alberta's population and generate uncertainties about the future. In addition, new alliances and political coalitions that advocated the idea of a more autonomous Alberta emerged, without necessarily seeking independence. Alberta's United Conservative Party, for example, has adopted a more aggressive stance on the defense of the province's economic interests, including the right to control its own natural resources. For these groups, economic autonomy did not necessarily mean political separation, but Alberta's ability to make his own decisions on crucial issues such as oil and gas exploration, which could strengthen his economy without depending on Ottawa's control. One of the most intense discussions within this debate was the issue of natural resources. Alberta has some of the largest oil reserves in the world, but disputes with the federal government about exploration and profits generated by these resources never ceased. During the Trudeau government, the province saw the implementation of several environmental policies that directly affected the energy sector, including the carbon tax and the ban on new oil and gas projects. For many Albertanos, these policies were seen as an attempt to stifle the province's energy industry and harm its economy. This perception further fueled the idea that Alberta needed more power over her own decisions and resources, something that, in some view, could only be achieved through independence. Another crucial point of the debate about the separation of Alberta was the cultural issue. Many in Alberta saw themselves more aligned with American values than with the progressive values of the Canadian federal government. the province shares many cultural and economic aspects with states such as Montana and Texas, which have economies centered on more conservative energy and values. This cultural alignment led to a discussion about Alberta's potential to become the 51st state of the United States. Although the idea was widely discussed rhetorically, it was not totally out of the question for some independence advocates. For them, joining the United States could be a way to ensure economic stability and protect the province's oil and gas industry. Supporting Alberta's idea of becoming an American state was also based on the idea that the province shared a political ideology similar to that of many conservative states in the U.S. Opposition to policies such as carbon tax and environmental government regulation made many in Alberta feel more aligned with U.S. states than with Ottawa's government's progressive vision. At a time when Canadian federalism seemed to become farther from Alberta's needs, the idea of a change of political alliance was seen as a real possibility for some. To the extent that Alberta's independence debate gained more strength, other elements began to shape the province's narrative. From 2025, the political situation became even more tense, with frustrations fueled by a decade of policies that many considered unfavorable to Alberta. The continuous rise of the Liberal Party and the implementation of its progressive policies, especially in environmental and economic issues, led many to question Alberta's role within Canada. It was evident that the province was increasingly alienated and on the fringes of decisions that affected his future. The proposals of laws in Alberta began to reflect this growing dissatisfaction. Bills began to emerge with the objective of enabling a referendum on the province's sovereignty, or even the issue of separation. The provincial government began to consider ways to turn Alberta into a more autonomous political center, with more control over their finances, their natural resources, and their energy policies. The separatist movement seemed to gain traction, especially with the growing popular support and the pressure of political leaders who saw in separation a way of restoring the economic and political power of the province. However, the concept of independence was not free of complexities. An independent Alberta would face huge challenges, especially in economic terms. The province would strongly depend on its natural resources, especially oil, to maintain its economy. But if separated, Alberta would lose the security network and the financial support of the Canadian federal government. In addition, the province would have to negotiate its position in international trade, its energy agreements, and possibly its currency. Not to mention the social impact of such a drastic change that it could generate internal divisions, with some Albertanos supporting independence and others opposing it for fear the effects of such a big break. On the other hand, there were those who defended a more pragmatic and less radical approach. Instead of seeking complete separation, these groups suggested a strengthening of provincial autonomy within Canada, but without cutting ties with Ottawa. The idea of a free Canada, or a province that could legislable and control its resources without interference from the federal government, was a proposal that gained popularity among many entrepreneurs and provincial politicians. This partial independence model could allow Alberta to maintain its connection with the rest of Canada, but with more control over its own economy and natural resources. This proposal was attractive to many, as it could result in immediate economic benefits without the risks of a complete separation. Within this debate, there was also a crucial cultural issue. Alberta has always seen herself as a more oriented province of the United States than to the rest of Canada. Its strong connection with the oil and gas industry, its culture of entrepreneurship, and its conservative roots are much more like those of American states such as Texas, Montana, and Dakota do Sul. For many in Alberta, joining the United States seemed like a logical option, as this could ensure greater control over natural resources and allow governance more aligned with their cultural and economic values. Alberta's perspective became a state of the United States was not a new idea, but began to gain more popularity after 2019 with the increase of separatist feeling. Donald Trump, former U.S. president, showed interest in the idea, seeing Alberta as a strategic province due to its vast energy resources and its geographical proximity to the United States. For Trump and his supporters, Alberta would not only be a rich oil province, but also a political ally with a population that shares conservative values similar to those of the Republican states. The proposal to integrate Alberta into the United States was enthusiastically received by some in Alberta, who saw this as a way to protect their economic and cultural interests. while distance themselves from the Canadian federal government. Alberta's idea became an American state divided public opinion, with critics pointing to the political and economic risks of such a movement. Adherence to the United States would bring significant challenges such as adaptation to U.S. laws and norms, changes in tax and health systems, and the loss of influence in some global political issues. However, advocates saw this change as an opportunity to ensure greater economic prosperity, especially for the oil and gas sector, and a way to finally escape Ottawa's policies that many considered harmful to the province's economy. In addition, Alberta's cultural proximity to the United States was also an important factor for those who defended the union with the neighboring country. The similarities between Alberta and states such as Montana, Texas, and Wyoming were evident, not only in terms of natural resources, but also in political and social values. For many Albertanos, the idea of an independent Alberta or united to the United States was not a radical view, but a natural extension of its cultural and economic identity. They believed that the province could flourish economically under the United States umbrella, with the ability to further develop their oil and gas reserves and create a more friendly environment for entrepreneurship.